A journey through the story of American cutting techniques would never be complete without the Vargases. The Vargases are probably the most famous gem cutting teachers in America. Most people have this book, or at some point everyone did have this book. So I had to look and see what was going on in 1977. There's an argument to be made for putting girdle facets on round stones, not just for square stones like emerald cuts. So they show a little diagram in the book, a drawing of a round brilliant stone, and half the stone has kind of traditional rounded, free spin girdle, and the other side has a faceted girdle with no smoothing out of the facets the way that we just heard about in Comprehensive Faceting book. We're starting to see that there's some idea in the culture that's telling people this is kind of a good idea. We should start faceting the girdles. It's going to make it easier for us to make sure that all the girdles are exactly perfectly the same width and height and everything like that. So this is starting to come into popular culture. It's not the norm though, because they're telling us as if it's a new idea. This is a new argument. Maybe you can consider this in your practice. So they're going to cut and polish all the girdle facets. That's how they want to do it. Then they're going to cut the main facets on a coarse lap, and they say, so the stone is easily realigned after the table. So these are like temporary facets. They're cutting in the mains, or maybe even just cutting in one main, and then they're going to take it out, put it in the 45-degree adapter, cut and polish the table, then put the dop back in the quill and realign it to that first main. So they've cut a main, or maybe they've cut all the mains so they can see how big the table looks versus the mains. And then now that the mains are there, when they put it back into the quill, they can put that main facet against the lap and, twist it, realign it, make sure it's perfectly lined up with the 96 index. Then they can proceed. So they're cutting all the mains with a fine lap, cutting the stars, cutting the break facets, and then they tell us you should always polish towards the girdle. So stars, then mains, then breaks. Transfer with a transfer block, cut the pavilion mains, cut the pavilion breaks, and then again we're polishing towards the girdle. The stone is done. So they already had polished the girdle from the beginning, they already polished the table from the beginning. The big one after 1977, the other one that I think probably everyone has seen or owned at some point, is the introduction to meat point faceting. So this is a pretty big deal, I think, for the history of American cutting and the history of the American technique. So this is 1985. Robert Long and Norm Steele, they were distributing the Seattle Fasteners newsletter, so they were also corresponding with a whole lot of gem cutters around the country and probably talking to a lot of different people about a lot of different techniques. They talk about a technique in their book, this new idea of like meat point faceting. And so they're kind of proposing this meat point faceting idea as a sort of a new way of cutting to make it easier for beginners and also maybe even to make it easier for advanced cutters, so that every part of the stone, every meets up in a very specific place, so you don't ever have to give any approximate instructions. Like you don't have to say the table should be about 55%, or the stars should go 40% down from the table to the girdle. They want to kind of get rid of this loose language and start using very precise stuff. P1 meets P2 at P3 or whatever. So when they talk about how you should follow the sequences in their book, because this is a book full of designs, they say we're using the modern sequence. And so they tell us actually this modern sequence, they didn't invent it, which I didn't know that. I thought that the sequence that they presented was their original idea, but they said actually the first time they'd ever seen this modern sequence was the September 1976 issue of the Fastener's Gem. And I was so overjoyed because I just got this 1976 copy of the Fastener's Gem. Totally randomly from a very kind lady on Facebook. She sent me a whole bunch of them that used to belong to, I think, her grandfather or something. I have never even looked at them yet because I just got them, and I've got about 30 issues, and they're basically just a club newsletter. It's a super small thing, not for sale, not well distributed. But of course, Long and Steel were, on the pulse of things, and they knew about this, and they incorporated this new idea into their book. So let's see what he has to say. So this is Quincy Howell, September 1976. So he calls this an easier method for faceting standard brilliance. More than likely, others have discovered the same technique, but it's time to give it a little publicity, especially for the sake of the beginners. So here's his way that he's found for cutting a round brilliant. So preform and round the girdle. Cut 16 break facets, 16 identical facets on the proper angle for the material. At this point, he says, it's simpler to establish the girdle line than when the main facets are cut. So this is the first time we see we're going to dop a stone, preform. We're not going to make the perfect girdle shape. We're going to make the break facets first and make the pavilion point first. Then we're going to facet in. It says establishing the girdle line. So he's going to facet in the girdle and make them match the pavilion break facets. This is the first time we've seen this in 1977. And this, I think, is the third and probably most quintessential thing that I see about American cutting that I've just never seen anyone else do. From there, he says, cut the pavilion mains, note how easy it is, polish and transfer. So then he says, we're going to flip the stone over. You're going to cut the 16 crown break facets at the proper angle. And at this point, the girdle thickness is easy to control. It's also easy to align the top and bottom girdle facet. If the girdle facets are properly aligned, there's no need to worry about the alignment of the main facets. They'll be right where they should be. So again, using the thickness or the width of the faceted girdle facets in order to measure and properly and easily align and cut the crown breaks. This is history in the making. So in this tiny little newsletter in September of 1976, we see the change. These guys are the ones that popularized it. They put it in their book. So they tell us the modern sequence. They've deviated a little bit from Quincy Howard. So again, this is 1985. Cut the pavilion breaks, then cut the faceted girdle, just like he was saying. Then you're going to cut the pavilion main. So we're doing pavilion first. We're cutting the girdle after the pavilion facets. We're going to flip the stone upside down with the transfer block. We're going to cut the crown breaks using the girdle facets as a measuring tool, just like Quincy Howell told us. We're going to cut the mains, we're going to cut the stars, and then the meat point faceting technique says you should polish in the same order that you cut in because there's no reason to deviate from it. It just makes everything more simple. You don't have to think about going backwards or forwards or polishing towards the girdle or whatever. You just do the same thing over again. Then remove and cut the table and polish. So the table in meat point, they specifically say the table is always the last step because when you take it out of the quill and have to put it back in, there's so much chance to make a mistake or not align it correctly. Before keyed dops, taking the dop out and putting it back in was a little bit of a hassle because if you misalign it, all of your facets are misindexed and messed up. So they're kind of making faceting as simple and easy as possible. And I think that this has like a pretty big impact on American cutting. I mean, from 1985 on, this was kind of like, as far as I can tell, the way that American cutters have been trained in lapidary clubs. It's the easiest way to learn. It's the simplest way. It's not the most flexible way. And they even tell us in the introduction of the book, it has its limitations. You know, if you're trying to cut a step cut this way, it doesn't really make sense because the step cut doesn't have a fixed meat point. You know, how deep the step goes, it doesn't mean anything. The design doesn't tell us how far to go down in the step cut. It's up to the cutter. So they admit this in the book. There's 2 or 3 limitations that they tell us that, you know, this sort of simplified meat point faceting technique isn't really suitable for, but they're okay with that. So the final book that we have to look at, and the most modern and relevant book, is going to be Amateur Gemstone Faceting. But before we go into this is 2014, so this is pretty modern. But there's one step here that we have to mention that doesn't really get documented in a book, which is GemCAD. 1988, he says he released the DOS version. So 1988 is like the first time we have a standardized diagram. So every book that I've just shown you has a totally unique way of writing the diagrams. Some of them are very complicated. The Long and Steel diagrams are pretty similar to what ends up being the GemCAD diagrams, but they have their own way of presenting the information. When we see GemCAD, we see everyone pretty much adapting to this way. Nobody really deviates from the standard GemCAD design ever, from 1988 until now. Long and Steel adapt to it, everybody adapts to it, and nobody else really puts out a lot of books after that, so there's not really other authors giving us other ways of cutting or other presentation methods of diagramming a design. So GemCAD becomes pretty much the standard for not just American cutting, but all cutting, because there wasn't any other way at that point. There wasn't any better way to write down a diagram and share it. So GemCAD becomes the standard. The GemCAD design kind of evolved from the meet point technique, and the meet point technique kind of evolved with GemCAD. These guys knew each other, they're talking to each other, they're helping each other make designs and thinking about how design should be now that we're in the age of computers. So there's a lot of interaction happening here. They're definitely independent, but meet point fastening and GemCAD are definitely like the final chapters that solidify this is how Americans cut stones, this is how Americans make diagrams, this is the order that we read the diagrams in, this is the order that we cut stones, which ends up being pavilion first, table last, and we're cutting the girdle after the pavilion breaks. So finally we've got Amateur Gemstone Faceting, Volume 1. This is Tom Herbst. 2014, this is kind of like the last book. This is the book that now everybody recommends and everybody has. And so I just wanted to see, does he deviate at all from what we just saw in any of these other books? Because I kind of feel like he really absorbs everything that came before and weeds out everything that's unnecessary and kind of makes a modern version of these instructions for the post-GemCAD, post-internet, post-digital mass machine gem cutting world. He says, first things first, we're going to orient the rough. Once we have our rough oriented, we're going to make a flat spot where we think the table's going to go. This is kind of be our temporary table. We're going to dop the rough against the flat spots. We're going to preform by faceting. So this is kind of how he's explaining this same technique. So he's cutting in his break facets, whether or not they're the final break facets or not, but he's basically making this what we're now calling a temporary culip point. He's making his culip point, he's cutting in his girdle facets to meet those girdle breaks where they've met at the temporary culip point. So this is really the heart of what it all comes down to, because if you use that method, you can't go wrong. The only problem is you can't make a round girdle anymore unless you go back to what Hoffman was telling us, which is round the girdle off after you finish the stone so you don't have those facets anymore. There's still these two different ideas, but mostly probably now everybody in America, especially by 2014, is fastening a girdle, and then whether they round it off or not is their own business. That's basically the story. So to sum it up, the things that I said at the beginning that make American faceting different than everybody else. First of all, the table adapter. So we see that in 1942. Basically, as soon as mass machines become widespread, they have to use the table adapter because the mass machine can't go to zero. It's just not safe for the way that the mast works. It's dangerous for the stone. So they identify right away that they need a table adapter. So that's the first thing. Second thing was pavilion first. That's one thing that we just don't see anywhere else in the world. Nobody else starts pavilion first except for people that are using mast machines that are kind of all descending from this original American technique of gem cutting. That's going to be optional, of course, and even today it's still optional, but it is basically the majority rule. Third thing is going to be faceting the girdle in order to do the measuring device. So we saw that in 1968 in Comprehensive Fastening Instructions by Hoffman. So that's the third thing. So the fourth thing is this idea that you don't really need to preform the stone. You can just dop your rough, and maybe you've just made a flat surface for your table and you've dopped the table facet to the flat dop, and you haven't made a preform at all. They sort of mention this a little bit in Vargas. The meet point faceting makes a clear point that preforming is optional, hand preforming like the traditional way. And Tom Herbst in 2014 also says the same thing. You don't need to preform. The way that he presents preforming is on the dop with the facets. So you're going to cut in your temporary brake facets, you're gonna cut in your girdle, and that for him is preforming. And I think today when we look at the techniques most widely used by American cutters, that's pretty much what I see. People dopping rough, cutting the brake facets, using the brake facets to cut in the girdle, using the girdle then as a measurement tool for fixing and finalizing the brake facets, cutting the mains, flipping it over, and then cutting in the perfect parallel girdle, the brake facets perfectly aligning to the girdle facets, and then cutting the rest of the stone so that one line follows from the cullet point, through the pavilion, through the girdle, through the crown, and meeting up at the table, and the American technique is born. So, as I said, this is quite interesting, it's different, it's unusual when we compare it to European traditional cutting, jam peg cutting, any kind of cutting, any cutting that's not mass cutting, totally different story. So it's been quite interesting to see all these different steps, all these different books. Basically every 10 years almost since the 1930s, we've got one little step added onto this chain that now has turned into something completely unique, completely different, and very special, I think. The whole story of American gem cutting is just something totally different than the rest of the world. It's quite cool. I hope you guys enjoyed this journey. If you are an American gem cutter, then I hope you feel a little bit of connection through all these links back to, J. Harry Howard in 1935, and, feeling like you are, and I am as well, the next link in that chain of American gem cutters, going on into the future. And who knows what will be the next iteration of American gem cutting? What do you think? Are we at American gem cutting's final technique, or are there more variations and deviations and advancements to come? So let me know, throw a comment down, or send me a message. I'd love to hear what your opinion is about where American gem cutting is going. This has been Justin K. Prim with the Gem Cutter's Craft, and I will see you guys all next time.